Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is the briefing. 90% of Africa was under direct or indirect European rule between 1880 and 1940. Immigrants subjugated local populations through religion and violence under the guise of extending supremacy and civilization. This left a legacy of human rights violations that continues to echo today in politics and culture, in part a maintenance of, in part a reaction against, Western norms and ideals. Of the 54 countries in Africa, it is illegal to practice homosexuality in 33. Protection against discrimination is available in 8, and only one country recognises same-sex marriage. In 4 countries, it is punishable by death. In 5, by life imprisonment. We polled our journalist fellows to ask which word comes to mind when thinking about LGBTQ rights in Africa. They said words like discrimination, stigma, and non-existent. Asked how many countries in Africa it was illegal to be homosexual in, 28% guessed over 33 and 72% guessed under 33. On average, they thought it was illegal in less than half of Africa. That's the briefing. Let's begin.
Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. I'm Caitlin Mercer, and today we're talking to Caleb Okereke. Caleb is the managing editor of Minority Africa, which he founded in 2019. He's a Nigerian journalist and filmmaker who works out of Kampala, Uganda, when he isn't studying for his master's in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he joins us from today. Before starting Minority Africa, Caleb produced features for BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, NPR, and Deutsche Welle, amongst others. And today we're talking about how he thinks we can approach stories about the marginalized. Welcome, Caleb.
Thank you so much.
Hey, it's good to have you. So a couple of caveats before we get going. We're going to be talking about Africa today, which is a complex continent with very different countries and cultures and norms. But to have this conversation, we might have to make some generalizations, talking about it as a monolith. And we're also talking about a lot of different minority groups, and we're going to be doing it through the lens of LGBTQ plus minorities in Africa. But all of that said, we're going to try and have a nuanced conversation about these two very broad fields. So, Caleb, I wanted to kick off by asking you, you're very specific when you describe Minority Africa that it's a platform for minority stories and not a voice for them. What's the difference? Why are you so strict on that wording?
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that when we talk about Minority Africa being a platform, it's essentially to sort of underscore something that we believe is a very crucial distinction to make, the fact that voices are constantly speaking, right? And sometimes we don't hear these voices, they are deliberately muted or ignored or just don't have enough ways to express themselves. And so sort of like that distinction between like a platform and a voice allows us to situate ourselves like in a place in which people can understand that it's not really about us, but about the voices that we platform. And I think there's a dual side to this. The other side of it is, especially in a continent where there's always been anti-LGBTQ plus propaganda, but it's growing even more. And I think sort of like just generally as it is backed by US evangelical groups, so there becomes an even greater like imperative, especially with stories of sexual and gender minorities, to even further situate ourselves in this place where we're not the voice, because when we're not the voice, it means that we are effectively resisting what I call like countering as a method. So the problem with what I conceptualize as countering is the fact that every single time that you say, let's counter propaganda, you are being forced into a playing field with propaganda in which we cannot win, right? Because we don't dictate the rules, we don't set the parameters of the game. However, what we sort of do on the flip side through the platform is narrative building. And narrative building is essentially centered on populating the media landscape with as much narratives as possible about marginalized groups, not as a response to propaganda, but just complicating the narrative, which is sort of how solutionism comes into it. And the hope is that people can see stories, see nuanced and complex stories as much as they see the pushback,
Yeah, that's interesting. What is how do you take a minority story and make it appealing to a mass audience?
That's a great question. And I think for me, I sort of think of the answer in two parts, right?
Mm.
And I think first of all, that we do care that a story performs, but sort of like the intention for that desire is a bit distinct from how perhaps others or perhaps just like mainstream media would regard it, right? So our desire for engagement or is not virality, right? It's not for us to go viral. It's more for us to create community. And I think that something changes when you approach your storytelling from a community perspective, from a perspective of I'm trying to make people get themselves to see themselves like in the stories we tell, as opposed to the fact that we're trying to get the stories to trend or be read by a wide audience. And I don't think that we have weekly editorial meetings, and I don't think that we've ever received a pitch and said in the last 3-4 years, we've never actually said, oh, this is a great pitch because it will trend or because people are going to read it. It's always just a great story because it's a story that deserves to be told. And I think on the flip side of that, the second part of it is we are fundamentally not trying to serve a mass audience or a wide audience, quote unquote. And it's not to say that we don't care who reads our stories. We do. We want people to read them as widely as possible. But sort of, if you look at any of even from like our earliest decks that we created about minority Africa, we kind of had this audience distinction or segmentation between like who we consider our primary audience and our secondary audience. And the whole time our primary audience has been people who, first of all, are from marginalized communities, right? And so we imagine these audiences to be these people. We sort of cater our storytelling to them fundamentally, first of all. And it kind of then works out that others can come read the story, but it's essentially like about the marginalized groups that we cover and everything that we do. So in terms of how there are times that in which we don't explain certain things because we know that our audience gets it. I think constantly adding layers of context can be distracting even for groups who actually get the context of
right.
that. And so we make certain language choices that reflect that we actually know who our audiences we're trying to cater to. It's kind of like I think of this Toni Morrison quote where she talks about just like standing like at the border, like on the margins, and sort of claiming it as central. And I think that's what we kind of try to do, like in the sense that we want to let the rest of the world, move over to where we are, right? And we just sort of where we are is mainstream. So yes, we do want it to get to a mass audience, but we're not trying to cater to a mass audience. And that sort of like affects the way in which we approach our storytelling.
Got it. So the traditional kind of mainstream media success metric would be loads and loads of PVs and the story appeals to lots and lots of people. That is a secondary metric for you. The primary metric is somebody's read the story and they felt seen.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. So what is the role of data journalism specifically in telling LGBTQ plus stories?
Yeah, I think it's sort of like an interesting conundrum, right? Because there's data and then there's LGBT people like in one sentence, which is basically contrary to everything that we know about sexual and gender minority, particularly in Africa, right? And for a demographic that's not often, mentioned in data, and data counted, and even when they're counted, you're not sure if it's data that's going to be weaponized against them. This sort of like requires us to, at a certain point, reconceptualize what we think of data. And I think of this particularly in like the anecdotal evidence sort of like instance, but I do think that there's a sort of like that corresponding like implication like allows us, and I think just generate the fact that I one thing that I find people use a lot when we talk about data or just storytelling or journalism at all is the word rigor, right? And sort of like rigorous, and I really hate that word because I think that it's trying to, it's what people dish out all the time to sort of push people and like perspectives to the margins, right? So for us, every single thing that we do and our like general like approach to data is how much rigor can we remove from the process as much as possible. And this would translate into us sometimes considering what people might view as questionable sources, right? But what again, because of the positionalities of people, like in our newsroom, what people actually know by experience. And so because you know it by experience, it makes a lot more sense to you, this source that might be non-reputable and or questionable.
I can literally hear the pearl clutching happening. Give us an example of what you mean by removing rigor. Like, what's an example of how you did that in a data journalism story?
Yeah, I think the very like similar one that comes to mind is more like how we do it with like case studies and like anecdotal evidence, right? So in terms of I know that we've covered there's a story that we did on the particular like on Discord, how queer people were being, you know, targeted like in Nigeria on apps like Grindr and Tinder and things like that, right? And we cited a source that was from a blog that had for a long time been sort of like cataloging these experiences, right? And I think that if I was to take that into a more traditional journalism space, people would ask, or if we were to take that into a more traditional space, people would ask, oh, like, how do you know this blog is actually real, or it's factual, or the events mentioned here are kind of true? But we kind of knew it was real because we just knew it was real, right? And so that's sort of like the ways in which we constantly, and people in our newsroom do that like all the time, and the journalists we work with, like we trust them to sort of use their positionalities to make sense of the situation. And I think that's such like a very crucially like important thing, because people know best what they're experiencing. And a lot of times the ways in which we ask for rigor can actually do more to sort of like entrench them like on their stories than what we intend to achieve.
Tell me more about how people were being targeted on Tinder and Grindr. Were they being targeted by police for prosecution or by the public for violence?
It was by the public. Yeah, and I think it's been going on for like a long time, and I know that Grindr did put like an advisory saying, "Oh, XYZ, be careful of this certain areas like in Nigeria." So it's people who go on these apps and then masquerade to be gay men or otherwise, and then sort of like target people and then just made out violence on them. Yeah.
And then how do you counter? I hear what you're saying, that rigor can be used to kind of silence voices intentionally or unintentionally, but what do you put in place to ensure accuracy when you're lowering the rigor to allow stories to be told? So for example, let's use that blog as an example. How did you let your readers know that where that information was coming from?
That's a great question. And I think sort of, I don't think that we conflate rigor and like accuracy, right? We kind of still do love to be accurate. We've strived to be the whole time. But I do think that, again, going back to what I said about who our audiences are, is, first of all, our audiences actually know that blog, right? Well, the people who are sort of like within the story in that category, not everybody, but a couple of them will know it, right? Because it's been there for a very long time. But I think, like, again, the metric for ensuring that we're being very accurate is sometimes we just ask people who we feel like have more experience, and we say, oh, do you want to look at this story? Because we want, especially for countries and places where we feel like we don't have enough experience to talk about, and for such positionalities, we also take it to people and we ask them and say, oh, do you have, and actually now we're just putting together like our first like advisory board for similar questions like that, because we want to go to people and say, we have this question about this story. We know it's traditional data, but what do you think about it? Do you think it actually makes sense from what you know? So I don't think that we sacrifice sort of like rigor or accuracy to sort of remove rigor or lower. It's similar. It's still the same process. We're just, and I think the problem is many people don't even consider the sources in the first place. Yeah.
Right. Do you have other examples of data journalism stories that you guys have undertaken?
Yeah, I think there was a time that we did a story on one of the very first queer pride matches like on the continent, which was in South Africa, and we kind of just sort of like ran through a timeline of like, and that was very interesting because I think before that story I didn't even know that it wasn't in South Africa, right? And we've also done some stories on I feel like it was last year, but it's not last year anymore. Well, last year, 2022 was last year. We covered sort of like this app that was helping queer people like in Uganda access sort of discreet and like affirming health care. It was like a descriptive app on which they could actually like access healthcare, like in a country where, of course, they can walk into any hospital and say, I want,
PrEP,
yeah.
for
So
example. Yeah. Okay, that's fascinating. Can you tell us, are there other unique ways that you use to tell minority stories? What else is different about Minority Africa's approach?
yeah, so many things. I think that the one that comes to mind now is, of course, one thing that I'm a passionate champion about and that I've kind of done in my own personal journalism career, which is solutions journalism and sort of constructive journalism. So I think a lot of the stories that I've personally covered, even in my independent journalism and even when I was a correspondent, was kind of like around solutions journalism, which simply put is kind of covering responses to social problems in the most simple way possible, right? I think that I found it very, very particularly fascinating when I sort of started to conceptualize Minority Africa, and nobody disagreed with me. So for context, I started Minority Africa in 2019. I have two incredible co-founders now, who's one of them is Shamia Ramdin, the other is Dipshika Parmeso. Shamia is an incredible entrepreneur who I'll talk about the project she's doing like a little later. But then they also like the idea of solutions journalism, so we just kind of carried on with it, right? And the point of liking it, I think, or why it sort of like makes sense to all of us, is that every single time that we sort of see the news about sexual and gender minorities on the continent, it's always consistently, if not mostly, from the lens of the problem, right? And I think this kind of like goes to every other minority group that we cover, whether it's refugees or women with or persons with disabilities or migrants and like asylum seekers. There's sort of like this underlying, sort of like framing that makes them look like they're passive victims who have no agency, and we don't get to hear stuff. And I think it's sort of like what the polls showed us like at the start. Now, all of this is true, right? There's stigma, there's discrimination, there's violence, but I do think that sort of like what solutions journalism like allows us to do is to reframe that coverage, right? And so now we sort of look at the problem, but now from the lens of the solution. So we still talk about the problem. It's not positive stories. It's not good news stories. We do sort of like talk about the problem in a similar way as we do the solution, but there's like an acknowledgement of agency in how we do it, right? So in terms of the fact that we're constantly saying with the stories that we tell that queer folks or disabled folks do have agency to actually respond to problems. And I think it just makes us feel good that we actually do have that, because we can talk about the problems all day long. And I think about one of the stories that we did in 2021 now, which was a story on a queer church in Uganda that was sort of like run by and opening its doors to queer people, and people were just, which I think we shared it like on a Sunday morning, and I just love the feedback. People were just so happy. They were like, oh, there's a church for queer people, fun, And so I think those kind of responses, there's still the fact that queer people can find space in like traditional religious spaces, but that's sort of like it's a hopeful lens, and it's also not dismissive of the problem. The other thing that it allows us to do is, and which I think is a very core tenet of the Constructive Journalism Institute, is sort of to be constructive even in how we do the storytelling. Because I think a lot of times we focus on sort of like what the output is, but we don't really think through how we're actually going about gathering the stories that we tell. So if you sort of look through our guidelines for coverage and reporting, we kind of platform a very constructive approach that allows us to acknowledge the agency of sources as we sort of like tell their stories at the same time.
Yeah. I heard about you, Caleb, because I was listening to an interview with you about that church story on the podcast, This Whole Story, Stop Me Quitting Journalism. And in that interview, there's a researcher, I want to say University of Wisconsin, who says that her research shows that minority communities respond more positively to solutions journalism. Has that been your experience?
That's a great question. Well, I can't say that my research, because I haven't done research, but I do know like personal experience that yes, that's the answer. And I think it's just people just love it. People just love it. And I think because the fundamental thing is people who are from marginalized communities are not like oblivious to the challenges that they primarily face, right? Because they live it every day. They breathe it every day, right? So it can do some like a great word of good for them to read about or sort of watch how other folks are responding. So I can say categorically that from like my personal interactions, from like the feedback that we receive on Instagram, on Twitter, and on email, and people who tell us, people actually do like the kind of stories that we tell.
Yeah. Here's a weird question for you. What is solutions, what's Sojo data journalism look like to you? Like, how would you approach a data-driven story with a solutions lens?
That's a great question. I think that when Sojo is done right, when Sojo is kind of done the way Sojo is meant to be done, even though there's no like way Sojo is, I mean, there's a way, but there's no strong way it's meant to be done. It's kind of open to interpretation. But when it's done how it's meant to be done, data is already a huge part of it, right?
It's at the heart of it, right?
So Sojo talks about things like sort of like showing evidence of impact. So for instance, when we're covering a story about the affirming app that was helping people like access discrete services, we knew about the story for a long time. I think we knew about it when they started it, but we couldn't cover it until there was sort of like a track record of impact on the fact that actually people want the solution and it actually works, right? So whereas positive news will just sort of cover things as they start, or just say, oh, this is a great like intervention, but it's not hero worship. It's not this is the best thing in the world. It's kind of looking at data, looking at what people are saying about it, sort of like considering what places have they been able to like impact, and then making conclusions based on that. That's what Sojo is. So it's difficult to remove it from data journalism. They kind of intertwined.
Hand in hand, yeah.
Yeah.
So when you're looking for people to write for Minority Africa, what are the qualities you're looking for? I'm assuming not traditional journalism.
No, I mean, I think it's yeah, I don't think so. I think that, when I used to freelance more often, you would sort of, when you're pitching an editor, you would kind of want to send, all of your clips and say, oh, like I've written here, I've covered here, and I have this experience and that experience. But I think that actually never factors in like how we consider. So the model that we generally use is a freelancer. And thankfully now we have a fellowship, but it was generally a freelance model like at the start. So we only had freelancers, and then we had in-house editors because that's what we could afford to do. And so every single time that we're sitting down and like thinking about a pitch, I don't think that we've ever actually said this person has no experience. Never, ever in the history. And I think some of the folks are here and they know, but like we've never actually said this person has no experience, right? We actually never even consider the experience. We just look at the story and say, is this a good story, or how do we make it a good story? So I think the fundamental thing that we look for is a story to tell and a lived experience. Because I do think that we can teach you how to do journalism. We can teach you the who, what, the why, when, how to code, how to interview, how to store interviews, what to keep in mind for an interview. But we actually can't teach you your story or to teach you a lived experience. And so we kind of fundamentally look for people who have a story to tell, who have an humility to sort of learn how to tell stories as well, right? And I guess that's not always clear from a pitch, but we know that I think the people that we've worked with are very like receptive to. Some our pieces take a very long time. Sometimes they take months, sometimes they take weeks, depending on the experience. We've had pieces take a whole year, and these are not even long pieces sometimes. But I think it just goes to show that we're very intentional, like about language, and we kind of want people to. We can't just say anything, at any time. So I would say fundamentally that we're looking for folks who have a story to tell.
Gotcha. I wanted to. We discussed this question before this seminar, and it's a big one, but I think we need to address it before we go to questions. Lots of questions in the Q&A and some questions coming in from the room downstairs. But before we go there, can we talk about, there's a certain group of people in Africa who would say, how do I phrase this? That the whole concept of catering for minorities is un-African, that we're a continent where cultures prioritize the collective, and representation of minority rights is a Western ideal. How do you respond to those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, and I think sort of like my response to them would be for them to read, and it's such a simple response, but it's honestly really true. Because I think that when they read, they'll sort of find out that it's not individualism if it concerns a group in the collective, right? And so a lot of the times when people say that, I feel like people kind of try to use things like that to sort of justify or legitimize their hate, and then they say, oh, it's a Western idea, or it's a Western concept. But in the thing that we most hear of it often, for instance, like, let's say queerness, right? It's definitely not a Western concept. I think there's so many examples of queerness like in Africa that they would find if they just actually sort of read about it. And I think that we try to do a good job of also like sort of covering the colonial history of also like how colonialism distorted African perceptions of things like gender and queerness. And I know it's a huge thing, but I do think that the fundamental thing is religion. I think that generally this collectiveness that we sort of platform assumes a sameness that is not always true, right? It sometimes goes ahead to sort of enforce that sameness. And I do have a problem with that, because I think that it's how we got here, like in the first place, because blanket approaches, or like assuming that everybody in the collective is the same, leaves a certain group of people whether or not we intend for that to be the case. And there's a way in which it can be useful, right? So things like transcontinental solidarity, there's a way that it can be useful, but I think we're often simplifying what is often a sort of complex and nuanced collective by insisting that what is and how do you even determine what is collective good, right? By asking the collective, which again is counterproductive.
If I were to play the devil's advocate here, or the devil's avocado, as I joke with my friends downstairs, I'm going to speak from a South African perspective of, and even then, I'm going to speak from like isiXhosa perspective of Ubuntu Gumuntu Gabantu, like people are people through other people, and push this notion of, yeah, but if you're catering for the minorities and not the majority, you're not prioritizing the good of the masses. How do you respond to that specifically? And let me just say, this is not me saying this. This is devil's advocate, because I think we need to address it for those who feel that way.
Yeah, you're doing a great devil's advocate job. I do. There's a way, and it's similar to the way that I respond to sort of the criticisms of like objectivity, quote unquote, as well, right? When people say that we're not being like objective in our storytelling, and I often say that we platform subjectivity, right? We kind of we're not going to give a platform to transphobic rhetoric just so we can be objective, because we feel like it has the whole world to express itself. It's a similar thing, right? There's no way that we're kind of catering to just the minority and then ignoring the majority, if the majority has the rest of the world to cater to it. We just have a very small chunk of the internet that we're kind of using to sort of tell the stories. That's not dismissing the collective. The collective still has the rest of the world, truly and literally, they do.
Yeah. And I guess you could argue looking after the least represented amongst a community ensures the entire community is looked after. So back at you. I have a question for you. Firstly, One is very angry because I didn't say Africa as a continent. I am sorry, One. I will say again that as I said at the start, we have to speak in some very uncomfortable generalizations to have this conversation. Africa is not a country and has very diverse countries, cultures, and norms, but we're going to use some generalizations in order to have try to have a nuanced conversation. Gosh, Kayla, this is I've been doing these seminars for 2 years. This is the first time I've gotten hate mail in the questions, but This is what you have to deal with on a daily basis. So I'm going to put on my big girl panties and move on. Stephen Mvula says, laws in most African countries outlaw LGBT rights. What are you doing to ensure that such countries repeal such laws? And that are usually embedded in the constitution. I mean, that's a big question. What are you doing to change the law, Caleb?
That's a great question. I cannot change the law. I mean, I hope that the law will change. I mean, I think there's several people who are doing like a lot of work that's like intersecting with like policy making and, you know, changing the law, quote unquote. But I do think what I envision our approach to be is that what we know to be law, you know, is inherently tied to a lot of times society, right? People make laws, right? And so our kind of secondary and used to be very lofty mission, even though we kind of now know that we can't sort of change people. And we don't know that people will change, but we hope that people will change, and we hope that when they change, they can correspondingly change those laws. So I would say we have a much more storytelling and narrative building like approach to laws. Everything kind of, you know, if the reason why, you know, it's criminalized or illegal is because people think it's wrong, you know, and so if we kind of change that mindset, hopefully, if not, we did our best. But if we can, you know, then those laws will be changed. So that's sort of our approach to it.
I'm going to go downstairs for a second. We have one of your countrymen in the room, Fisayo. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Caleb. Good to see you again.
See you too.
Yeah, so I was going to ask if you've ever considered getting into the mind of your audience through the back door, you know, writing on minority issues through social issues that you know that they are originally, you know, always interested in. I gave the example of how I wanted to write about LGBT plus rights, and I knew that in Nigeria it's not a topic people want to hear. And I had to get into the mind of people writing about fake prophets who take money from, you know, people who are gay and promise that they can convert them to straight, and they are unable to, and they feed them with fake prophecies and take their money. You know, people read that story without really seeing this guy is talking about LGBT plus rights. They saw pastors oppressing LGBT plus people. So is that a strategy you've ever tried to, you know, just to sneak into the without really saying that that's what you're trying to do, just so that they become more conversant with the issues and they discuss it? Is that an approach that you tried?
That's a great question. So first of all, I read your story and I like it. And I shared it, of course. But I think that's just like talking about the strategy. I do think that a huge part of our model is also doing what you're kind of suggesting, even though in a much more subtle way, right? So that the fact that we do stories about minorities, people have said it's such a broad category, you know, it's not centered on one group, so that can be a challenge. But I do think that in a sense, that is part of the model, right? We want you to sort of come to our website and read a story about the women's rights or the rights of persons with disabilities or migrants, you know, and then sort of get the algorithm on the site tell you, oh, but you might also be interested in this story about queer people in Uganda, right? And so the subtle messaging in there is the fact that oppression is intersectional, you know, and it's kind of, it's in your best interest for you to realize that as much as you're oppressed as, let's say, a woman or a person with disability, you can also be oppressing queer people, right? So I think that's one way that we do it. I don't think that we're gonna try the sort of writing about social issues angle, just simply because fundamentally, as I said earlier, our audience is kind of, first of all, minorities, but we're thinking of ways to kind of take our stories outside of our own newsroom, right? So when I was talking about my co-founder, Shamia, he's been leading a project that we're working on with Google News Initiative, which is allowing us to build a story agency, right? And the idea of the story agency is that people can kind of, it's called like advance. So you're essentially meant to like advance minority stories. And we have around 10 newsrooms now who are signed up and who sort of read and then share our content, because we do publish under a Creative Commons license, so we want folks to share, but we're also kind of taking very small number of like exclusive commissions from news organizations to work on stories. So I think that there's ways in which we can force it into like the mainstream and, you know, maneuvering into people's, like, where they get their news every single day. But I think it's a bit harder for us to sort of sneak in because we're fundamentally trying to cater to marginalized groups first before others. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's talk a bit more about that story agency. So who would you be hoping to purchase and run those stories?
Yeah, so I think that we kind of want everybody on it. We want everybody who has a platform that's distinct from us anywhere in the world. We're focusing now, first of all, on like African newsrooms. So I think the newsrooms that we have now are from Nigeria and Uganda, but we kind of want everybody to be on it. The concept is it's been more of a resource and like a technology implemented growth, because it's a very manual process for us right now. So what we're doing was we're kind of uploading stories on Google Drive, and then folks are going to get the stories off of there. But what we're doing now with Google is we're building an application, and that's what Shamir is working on with a team of incredible engineers and researchers who are working on like a web application that will sort of like allow newsrooms to get those stories in a 2 to 3 click process into their own backends. And so when that happens, and when we kind of launch it, we can then onboard as many people, or like an even greater number of people onto it.
Brilliant. And have you managed to start syndicating to some broadsheets already?
Syndicating what?
Have you managed to get some of those stories placed in mainstream media already, that people that you've already partnered with?
We do have, yes, we have.
Great, that's fantastic. I have a question for you from Tando Naluyima. She says, how do you create psychological safety for LGBTQ plus communities in Africa? That's, again, a huge question that I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer to, but what do you think part of the answer might be?
That's a great question. I think that part of the answer is, I often return to storytelling because I think it's something that I like to do, and it's something that I've done for the longest time of my life, and I just love it. So I think there's a way in which storytelling does create connections, right? And I think I've seen this in our coverage, but in like generally like in the work that I've done. I think that when you, first of all, when you write a story like about somebody, you are creating community with them. Like, you're essentially saying like, I see you and like I respect you. So a lot of times people who have sort of like been sources to us, quote unquote, what you consider to be sources, have actually gone to like work with us on other projects after, right? Because we actually get to know them like a bit more, especially people who we cover ourselves or like by our fellows and which are uncovered by freelancers. So I think in a way, the question of psychological safety is larger than Minority Africa, it's larger than us. But I do think that I see there's something that feels safe in knowing that someone like respects you, like, in your story, and there's a connection that is formed from that. Yeah,
there's a duality there. There's being able to tell your story, but also being able to see yourself in other people's stories. So yeah, I do think you're part of that answer. Let's go to Tanmoy downstairs.
Hey Caleb, absolutely riveting. Thank you so much. I could relate to a lot of this because my work is about people with psychosocial disabilities in India, but also globally. My question is about the sustainability of platforms such as yours, because when you write about and for people from, I can see you're already nodding, so maybe I'll just cut that question short. What is your plan to keep going financially and make it sustainable?
That's a great question. That's just a very great question. I think, like a lot of the things that I've talked about are, people sometimes forget that like media costs money, and I think people forget that people work in media and people cost money, and then corresponding media costs money, and there's also all of this cost. And even when I started it, I always said that when I started my Minority Africa, I didn't know that things cost money and that you had to like do things with money. I would say that so far we have entirely relied on grants, so we've kind of had a very simple model of just give us money and we'll do XYZ and XYZ. And even those grants, I still think that we're very not as funded as we can be. There's everybody or most people like on the team, have to like work 2 jobs, so there's nobody who's like working. I'm doing a master's, I get stipend from school, but I'm also working in minority. So there's all of those things. But I think in the long term, and what we're trying to do with our new platform called Advance is we're trying to first, people can sort of share stories that we publish for free, Creative Commons license, but we're also trying to work on exclusive like story commissions for news organizations as a story agency, right? So that's one way in which we want to pull some revenue in that we think will be able to at some point sustain the publication. The other way is still on the like advanced, but we've done some trainings and we kind of want to expand those trainings. So we've trained some news organizations. Now we're doing a project in Uganda that's called the GBV Spectrum with the French Embassy, where we're training journalists on how to sort of like report on gender-based violence when it occurs across the spectrum. So with trans people, with gay people, with refugees, like when there's intersections with GBV, how do you cover it, right? So we want to take some of those trainings that we've done and sort of make them into online courses and then be able to sort of sell those courses to some organization. So that's one way in which we also want to make money. We don't know if it will work. And if it doesn't work, I'll just come back to you and say, oh, like we're still writing for grants and stuff. But that's a really great question. That is, honestly, it's actually like exhausting to constantly have to, fundraise to keep the work going, but it has to be done.
Ayen messaged me to say her question has been answered, but Ayen, would you mind asking the question about safety?
Sure. Thanks for taking the question. So one of the challenges that we have in South Sudan, where I'm from, is keeping journalists safe who report on sensitive issues. And I'm just wondering what your strategy is for yourself and for your staff.
That is a great question. So there's two parts to it, right? The very first part is our just knowing that what we have as a strategy can't work for everybody, right? That's the first part that we kind of like, and it's also not needed by everybody like at the same time. But I'll say that I know that what we do is a lot of times we sometimes anonymize journalists. So you don't know who's writing the story, but we know them and that's fine. And we're the ones who know them. And I think that's one way that we've done it. The other way is we sometimes don't locate journalists. So the journalists who we don't tell you where they are, but they just sort of write a story about this general thing. And we also try not to locate ourselves as much as possible too, right? Especially with our team that's based on the continent. So you never find an address for us on the internet just because we don't want people to go there and, I don't know, pick up somebody or something. So there's some intentional choices that we make about certain things like how we present ourselves. And I think one of the things that has worked for us is I don't think people realize that we're in Africa, which sometimes works to our advantage, and I think it's a very intentional and even if they do, they don't know where in Africa we are, so it's a very intentional and deliberate because we do have like a continental span and like outlook. So it allows us to say many things about many places in many ways.
That's interesting. Like a deliberate play on the cliche for safety purposes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's interesting. I have a question for you from Shaheen, who says that transitioning towards contextualized evaluation criteria is central to decolonial efforts. So that's where Shaheen's coming from when she asks, how can one measure success when success is relationality and trust?
That is a great question that we're still asking ourselves and that we continually ask ourselves. But I'll say some of what we've come to so far is in terms of we're thinking, who do we need to measure success for, right? And I think that sets the tone to how we approach the conversation, like in the first place. If we're measuring it for ourselves, I can tell you that we feel we're very successful in terms of the stories that we've told, in terms of the people that we've connected with, in terms of the places that, like, we honestly love them, the stories that we do tell. So if you ask anybody in our newsroom, we do feel we're successful, right? But if we're measuring success for maybe a funder, then that becomes like a much different terrain because people want to see metrics such as how many people have you reached, where's your reach, what's your audience size, things like, and we do report on those things, right? So I think for us, we've been thinking of sort of like just redefining what success means to us, and by that standard, we're already successful. And then now we're kind of separating that from what we need to do to be successful for other people, right? And we do that. So now we do track things like who's reading our stories, from where. We try to like have very like and there's also like the fact that because we don't take as much data from our readers. We only, I think, have people's emails. We don't even have names, just because we feel like that's also a strategy, because we don't want to have their names because it becomes
Don't want to be hacked. Yeah.
Keep those names, right? So we do just take emails. So then that means that we're there's not so much that we know about our audiences to a T or to an I, and that's also intentional, right? But that also like impedes how much info we can sort of, or conclusions that we can reach about them, right? So I'd say broadly that now we're kind of tracking success in the general way, in terms of we're working on speaking to a few people who subscribe to us this year, and just sort of hearing from them and saying, like, what do you think about, and sort of making conclusions from those few people that we speak to. We think it would add some nuance to the way that we write our reports. But I do think that we already feel successful based off of the stories that we tell, and we feel trusted because people tell us that they trust us. People tell me, people tell other people, not just me.
Maybe you should put a survey on the front of your website that says, how lonely do you feel on a scale from 1 to 10? And then after they finished reading an article, how lonely do you feel on a scale of 1 to
honestly
10?
Sounds like a good idea. It's very simple. My work.
Oh gosh, donor reports. Cry. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. An anonymous says, what has addressing the minority gotten them in South Africa? Apartheid.
I can't see the question. That's why I'm looking.
I think, yeah, they're saying, well, in South Africa, which is the country that we mentioned at the beginning, where same-sex marriage is allowed, and it probably has the most advanced rights for LGBTQ plus communities. This person is saying that giving minority groups those rights has resulted in apartheid. I'm not sure how much coverage have you done from South Africa, and do you get that impression that giving people rights has caused more oppression?
No, and I don't think that it's true.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not true. Apartheid was over before the rights were extended. Just, I don't know. I felt the need to ask it. And then the other anonymous question is, the LGBT community in Uganda specifically is very hostile. Oh, I see. Okay, they're saying it's very hostile for the community. That makes sense. And so how do you ensure the safety for your journalists, which you've answered already? The second part to the question is, have journalists been able to report confidently when they're putting their lives on the line?
That's
that.
Yeah, I think there's probably one aspect of that I didn't touch on, which is the aspect of sort of like visibility versus invisibility, and sort of like how we, and it goes both ways for both sources and journalists. But I do think that to a very, especially in a place like Uganda, and we've seen this happen in other places that we've worked on, like on the continent. People are tired of, not everybody, but some people are tired of being like on the margins and being hidden, right? So a lot of times when you watch stories about sexual and gender minorities previously, they would just sort of show people's, heads and hands and the backs of like the back of their heads and their hair, and never actually showing their faces, right? And I think when we started, we were very surprised to find that people actually just wanted to be sometimes seen, like name me, put my picture there, put my face up there, and it sort of went against everything, because I studied journalism, and I'm still now studying journalism, but I studied journalism in my undergrad, so it kind of went against everything that I thought that I learned in journalism school, which was protect your source, what's best for your source, if you like anonymize the source, but I do think a lot of times I have people who are sort of like who are sort of insisting on visibility, and for us to kind of assume that we know what's best for them. As long as people do understand the risks of what they're doing, as long as they know that this is how we reach, this is the way it can go, this is what can happen. There's people who still confidently want to say that they want to be seen. And this applies to our journalists as well. And of course, there's measures that we do take to kind of ensure that people feel safer. So for instance, if you watch some of our videos, we kind of try to do very close shots, so you don't know where people are, like especially when we're covering stories that we feel like are very sensitive. So you can't tell, like the church we covered, you couldn't tell the location of the church by watching that video. That was very important for us, right? But everybody in the church wanted their face to be on camera. They wanted to be seen. We even had more interviews than we're able to actually use in the actual story, right? So it's the same approach that we have to journalists as well. Sometimes journalists actually, contrary to what you think, do insist on safety. When they don't, on visibility. When they don't, we kind of go the route that I talked about, which is like we don't press for visibility, and most of the time people are actually offering it to us.
We have a question from Tarje from Norway downstairs. Tarje, I'm going to summarize it for you if you don't mind. Tarje is working on a project where people will be able to use freedom of information requests to request data from other countries. And so his question is, how easy is it for you to access data in the countries you're working in? Should we start with, is there data in the countries you're working in?
Of course, there is data. I do think that we're
official government data.
Yes, and I do think there's official, but again, there's sort of problems with that, right? And I think it's different as you kind of move across the continent, right? So in South Africa, and like Botswana, you probably have more data, which of course is still not perfect, so we covered the story like about the census in South Africa, which didn't allow people to identify as trans. It was just like male or female, so there's all of those nuances. And I think it's about what kind of data you're looking for as well, right? So if you're looking for data on the disability rights and disability justice, that's much more readily like available. But if you're looking for data on sexual and gender minorities, it's often just not there, right? And a lot of times people do feel like, counting them is acknowledging that they're here, which they don't want to do, right? So there's a lot of concerns like about what data exists, and then there's concerns about how to access the data as well. I do think that again, because I talked about how we kind of rely on very non-traditional sources of data, we've not had sort of direct for any story that we've done, we've not really had like direct encounters with like getting like official government data for especially sexual and gender minority story, because it often doesn't exist or just doesn't make sense for us to use that it exists.
So a question from Christina. She says, I know you only started in 2019, but do you feel like the situation is easier or worse since COVID-19? The situation being reporting on LGBTQ plus issues. Did it have an impact?
I think the situation is worse, and I think that's not an easy conclusion for me to reach, but I do think just like given what I see every day, and I'm just like, oh my God, it does feel worse. And I'm talking specifically like about places like, Ghana, for instance, where there's this debate of this draconian bill, and places like Uganda, where there's been heightened propaganda much more. And I think I just wrote a piece that which will be published soon, like about it, just sort of talking about how how a lot of the propaganda that we see now on the continent being sort of propped up by US evangelical groups are not new. They're using the same arguments. And so like my hope with that piece was to sort of tell people that just sort of wake up, like you can't listen to the same narrative every 5 years being used to sort of like mobilize you into anger or sort of like some moral panic, right? So I do think that it is worse. I do think that, and I don't think it's unconnected to a lot of what's happening like in the US as well, right? Because when people sort of talk about, sex panic sound like moral panic, like in America, like let's say things like to do like transgender rights. I don't think that, I think those sort of like conversations go ahead to sort of embolden Africans who then think that because, I don't know, America is talking about it, then we should talk about it. So I think it's worse, but I don't think it's hopeless at the same time.
I know that this is not the point of your work in any way, shape, or form, but have you ever had people telling you that through interacting with Minority Africa content, they changed their minds on the issues?
Yes, I've had people tell me that personally. I have. And that's why I say if you kind of ask us personally, we feel very successful because we feel like people have actually changed their minds or learned about something they didn't know previously, or learn about a community in a way they had never seen them previously. So in my own bubble, I can say, oh, it feels good. People are actually changing their minds, but I still don't, every single time that we post something, or many times you see people in the comments saying this is not African, this is go away, it's not African. So it's people still think like that, and that and I think we kind of, and that's why we don't sort of rely on changing minds as the metric for if we're successful. We rely on like how much are we complicating the narrative, right? That's what success means to us.
Yeah. What do you recommend people read if they've gone through this entire hour conversation and they still think homosexuality is un-African? What would you suggest that they read?
Well, first of all, read Minority Africa. We do have some really like great pieces that sort of talk about that. So there's two that come to mind, and I think the title of one is how colonialism distorted gender, like in Africa. There's another one that is about homosexuality is not on African, it's homophobia that's new. And then there's one of my favorite recent pieces that is also just because it's Nigerian, it's like election season, like in Nigeria. So now I have this piece, and I just love it because like it's a piece on how queer folks are kind of campaigning for their choice presidential candidate on Grindr and Tinder, and sort of putting this and then telling people like, oh, like
wow.
They're like, we won't have sex if you don't vote, so I'm like, okay, cool, love the effort, so that just makes me feel happy. So read that. And then I would also say read a book that I'm currently reading again, which is Female Husbands and Boy Wives of Africa. It's like this collection of academic essays, so it can kind of feel academic, but it has so many examples of, especially countries that we don't hear of often, like in the discourse about how queer rights or queer people existed on the continent before. It has so many examples from South Sudan, and like Angola and so many, and Central African Republic, places that we actually don't hear of us often in that discourse.
Great. Caleb, thank you so very much for spending time with us today. As I said, I found this very unique in the fact that I don't usually get people so angry in the comments section. And it's a real eye-opener that you're having to deal with that every single day. It's not uplifting. And so I really do wish you more power and every success and resilience for your message, which is essentially treat people fairly and equally. I should say that if you were watching today and you really want to be in the room downstairs, you have 1 week left to apply for the fellowship program. So hurry up and do that. As journalists, I expect everyone will apply in the final 15 minutes before midnight. But it's been fantastic talking to you, Caleb, and thank you.
Thank you too. Likewise.